This is Daniel from a Different Direction, a series on the book of Daniel from a chronological view rather than a chapter by chapter view. Part 1, the life and times of the prophet Daniel. Part 2, the first four kingdoms, which include Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. Part 3, the sanctuary. Part 4, the divided kingdoms and the medieval church system. And Part 5, the culmination of history. In the previous video, I did the empires of Babylon and Medo-Persia. This video will be on Grecia. I'd like to review our rules for interpretation. These are a guideline to going through the prophecies in the book of Daniel. First one there is Daniel 2 is the template for the other prophecies in the book of Daniel. Next, prophecies are repeated and enlarged upon. And next, the Bible interprets itself, starting with the immediate context, then moving out to surrounding passages, and then to other passages in the book of Daniel, and to finally the whole Bible. And especially if there's any areas where we can find Jesus mentioning Daniel or referring to the book of Daniel, we want to include that. The four prophecies of Daniel. Daniel chapter 2, world empires as lifeless metals. Daniel chapter 7, world empires as wild beasts. Daniel chapters 8 and 9. This is on God's judgment and his coming kingdom. And then Daniel 10, 11, and 12, these are great conflicts of nations. While we introduced Daniel chapter 11 in the previous video on Medo-Persia, there are some elements in chapter 11 that really become important when we're going through that part of the prophecy. First, Jesus is the center of Daniel 11, and in verse 22 we find that. But before that verse, the focus is on God's people in the Jewish nation. And after verse 22, the focus is on God's spiritual Jews in the Christian church. See Romans 2, 28 and 29. Verse 22 says, armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken, even the prince of the covenant. And we know that Jesus is the Prince of the Covenant. Next, even with incredible detail, determining fulfillment is often difficult. We've got an example in verse 23. And from the time, what time? An alliance, which alliance is made with him? Who's that? He, who's that? Shall act deceitfully, and he, who is that? Shall become strong with a small people. Well, is the small people the Romans, the Jews, or somebody else? So some of these passages are just difficult the way they're written, and we have to look at the context and the things going on in history to determine what the interpretation is. Next, kings and kingdoms in chapter 11 end when their authority and or power is superseded by another king or kingdom. An example is Daniel 11 verse 2, behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia, and a fourth shall be far richer than them. And when he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up against the kingdom of Grecia. Now we know that Xerxes the first lost to the Greeks in the battle of Salamis and the battle of Plateau in around 480 BC. And then you have a power shift away from Medo-Persia to the Greek Empire. Even though there are 7 Persian kings after this that reigned, but we have a power shift now to Greece. Now Daniel 11 has what I like to call compass texts, which will give us direction and the location in the chapter. So the first of these is The prophecy of the text fits its historical situation nearly perfect. And we see that in Daniel 11:22. It says, armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken. That refers to Rome with its terrible Roman legions. Even the Prince of the Covenant, and that would be Jesus. He was crucified on the cross under Roman domination. Then we have the phrase, do as he wills, to designate a new king or kingdom. In verse 3, we have Greece. Then a mighty king, Alexander the Great, shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do as he wills. Then we see this in verse 16 with Rome. But he, Rome, who comes against him, the king of the north, shall do as Rome wills, and none shall stand before Rome. And he, the king of the north, shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his hand. Now I wanted to review a summary of the prophecies of Babylon. Babylon ruled from 608 BC to 538 BC. It was one of the richest nations ever. It lost its glory in the later years after Nebuchadnezzar. King Cyrus conquered Babylon in 538 BC. We find that in Daniel chapter 5. Babylonian Empire is found only in the prophecies of Daniel 2 and 7. So the summaries of the Medo-Persian Empire, it ruled from 538 BC to 331 BC. The two arms represented two kingdoms from Medo-Persia. In Daniel chapter 7, we have the bear raised up on one side, which refers to the Persians being the dominant force in the coalition. The three ribs in its mouth were the three kingdoms it conquered, Babylon, Lydia, and Egypt. From Daniel chapter 8, we've got the ram with the lower horn was Media, which came up first, and then the higher horn was Persia, which came up later and dominated the Medes. From Daniel chapter 8, the ram pushes westward to conquer Babylon, northward to conquer Lydia, and southward to conquer Egypt. From Daniel chapter 9, the 2300-year period regarding the sanctuary started in 457 BC. The nation of Israel was given a final probation period that was last into the Roman Empire until 34 AD. Jerusalem would be totally rebuilt by 408 BC. Three kings of Persia are Cyrus the Great, Cambyses II, and Darius I. The rich, powerful fourth king was Xerxes I, which was the husband of Queen Esther. And then Persia fought against Greece, and then the dominating power in Daniel 11 goes to Greece at that point. God's people under Babylonian and Medo-Persian rule. This is something that I've added, and I didn't have it in the previous video, but I think it's important to know the characteristics of God's people during this time. So in Babylon, they had the pagan world around them. The physical temple was in ruins, and there was a test for God's people. Will they compromise like the whole world around them, or stay true to God and his principles and be persecuted and ostracized? And then Medo-Persia, you had the Jewish world around them because they are back in Judah. You have the physical temple being rebuilt, and the test for God's people. Will they complete the work God gave them to rebuild Jerusalem, or be frightened into inaction by the surrounding nations around them? Now, the Empire of Grecia, there was a united or unified empire under Alexander, who conquered, all of the nations of the Greek Empire. However, when he died in 323 BC, it passed to his very young son, who was really too young to rule, and Alexander's half-brother Philip III. Now they attempted to keep the empire unified, but they were unable to do it, and it was eventually split up. Macedonian Greece regions went to Cassander, and these are generals, Alexander's generals. Thrace and Asia Minor regions went to Lysimachus. Egypt, Cyprus, and portions of Asia Minor went to Ptolemy I, and the Indus River region went to Seleucus I. This period is often called the Hellenistic period. And the four regions that we had, different things developed out of those. The area of Thrace and Asia Minor under Lysimachus in 281 BC. There was the Battle of Corpus-Pendulum, and this area went to Seleucid. The Macedonia and Greece regions under Cassander, they basically ruled autonomy until they were defeated by the Romans in the Battle of Pydna in 168 BC. Now, the two main regions that affected Palestine was the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic Empire. So, the Indus River region, which is the Seleucids, this ruled independently until 64 BC, when Pompey defeated Antiochus XIII. He deposed and he killed him. And then Egypt, Cyprus, and the nearby Asia Minor regions. This is the Ptolemaic dynasty. This ruled independently until 31 AD and was defeated by Octavian, who later became Augustus Caesar. Now, even though they had distinct battles, okay, to end their domination, the Romans actually came in there 100 years or so before that and started to dominate the regions. But the Seleucid dynasty and the Ptolemaic dynasty really continued until they were defeated in battle by the Romans. Now, the Seleucid dynasty is known in this section as the King of the North because they were north of Palestine. You will see that I have 6 highlighted rulers of the Seleucid dynasty. Those are the 6 that you will find in Daniel chapter 11. Now, the dynasty continued on, but after Antiochus III, we have Rome coming onto the scene. And so we don't have any other prophecies in the book of Daniel because Rome is the dominant power after Antiochus III. Now, the Ptolemaic dynasty is referred to as the King of the South in Daniel 11. And you'll see again that there are 6 highlighted and bolded rulers of the Ptolemaic dynasty. That's where the Romans came in and began to exert their influence in the region. And so while the dynasty continued on, the Romans were the dominant power in the region. So Grecia in Daniel 2 and 7, again, I've combined these 2 chapters because they're similar and they're kind of short. In Daniel chapter 2, verse 32, it says, in the middle and its thighs of bronze. And then it interprets this as, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over the earth, in Daniel 2:39. And then in chapter 7, we have, after this I looked, and behold, another like a leopard, with 4 wings of a bird on its back. And the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given it. Daniel 7:6, with the interpretation, these 4 great beasts are 4 kings who shall arise out of the earth. and of course Grecia being the third of those great kings. So we have the fulfillment here with Alexander's army was known for its speed, and in about 10 years it conquered more territory than any other empire before it. The four heads were Alexander's generals, who divided up the empire after his death. Now, the prophecies of Greece in chapter 8, verses 6 through 8, it says, "As I was considering, behold, a male goat came out of the west, across the face of the earth, without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. And he came to the ram with the two horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him, and struck the ram and broke its two horns, and the ram had no power to stand before him. But he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him. And there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it, there came up four conspicuous horns towards the four winds of heaven." Then we have our interpretation in verses 21 and 22. "And the goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between his eyes is the first king. And for the horn that was broken, in place which others arose, four kingdoms shall arise from this nation, but not with his power." You have the fulfillment of the prophecies from Daniel chapter 8. Greece is west of Babylon. The Battle of Arbela occurred in 331 BC, giving Alexander control of the Persian Empire. The last forces of Persia, they were defeated at the Battle of the Persian Gate in 330. Alexander then trampled down the ceremonial capital of Persepolis. Alexander then died in 223 BC. Alexander's young son was murdered at the age of 14 and was unable to continue the family reign. The Battle of Ipsus in 301 cemented the kingdom into the four divisions under the four generals. Cassander took Macedonia and Greece. Lysimachus went eastward in Thrace and Asia Minor. Ptolemy took over Egypt, Cyprus, and portions of Asia Minor. And Seleucus took over the Indus River area. We find a lot of detail in Daniel chapter 11 about the first six kings. Daniel 11 verse 3, "Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do as he wills. Alexander, the Grecian Empire." Notice the words "do as he wills." That tells us this is a new king or a new power that's come on the scene. Verse 4, "And as soon as he has risen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided towards the four winds of heaven, but not to his prosperity, nor according to the authority which he ruled. And his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others besides these." So we got divided to the four winds, and each of these divisions, you can say Lysimachus in Thrace and Asia Minor was to the north. To the south, we've got Ptolemy in Egypt. To the east, we got Seleucus going to the Indus River, and to the west, you have Cassandra in Macedonia and Greece. Not to his prosperity. For 25 years, Alexander's half-brother tried to keep the divisions together, but his only son and by a Persian mother, they were poisoned in 310 BC by Cassandra. And so it did not go to his heirs. Verse 5, "Then the king of the south shall be strong, But one of his princes shall be stronger than he and shall rule, and his authority shall be a great authority. The king of the south was located to the south of Palestine. This is Ptolemy the First. Assisted one of the princes, or Seleucus the First, to regain the territories of Mesopotamia in 312 BC, and Seleucus the First became actually greater than Ptolemy the First. Verse 6. After some years they shall make an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north and make an agreement. But he shall not retain his strength of her arm, and he and his arm shall not endure. But she shall be given up, and her attendants, he who fathered her, and he who supported her in these times. So we now see the king of the south and the king of the north wanting to make an alliance. So the king of the north obviously is located north of Palestine, but this is Antiochus II. In 251 BC, he marries Bernice, the daughter of Ptolemy I. Ptolemy, of course, is the king of the south. They have a son, but then they separate, and Antioch II reconciles with his wife and sister Laodice. Antioch II then dies suddenly, possibly by Laodice, who also had Bernice and her son killed, along with her Egyptian attendants. And so we see this attempted alliance here that was broken. And one of the things that this alliance included was a little love triangle that really turned out bad. And from a branch of her roots, one shall arise in his place, and shall come against the army, and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he shall deal with him, and shall prevail. So in 246 BC, Ptolemy III invaded Syria in revenge for his sister Bernice, and was victorious all the way to Mesopotamia and established Egyptian sea power. Verse 8, he shall also carry off the Egyptian gods with their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold, and for some years he shall refrain from attacking the king of the north. So in 239 BC, Ptolemy III brought back enormous amounts of Egyptian treasure that had been looted by the Persians, but he didn't attack the Seleucid Empire again. Verse 9, then the latter shall come into the realm of the king of the south, but shall return to his own land. Seleucid I tried to march against Ptolemy III in 240 BC and regain the wealth that he lost, but he was defeated and he was turned back. In verse 10 we have, his sons shall wage war and assemble a great multitude of forces, which shall keep coming and overflow and pass through, and again shall carry the war as far as his fortress. So the sons here are Seleucus II, Seleucus III, and Antiochus III would carry on the war against Ptolemy, the king of the south. But this would happen in the Palestine region. In 219 BC, Antiochus III took the fortress of Seleucia, or a port of Antioch on the Mediterranean Sea. Verse 11, the king of the south, moved with rage, shall come out and fight against the king of the north, and he shall raise a great multitude, but it shall be driven into his hand. In 231, at the battle of Raphia, Ptolemy IV met Antiochus III, each with huge armies of around 60,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, 100 elephants. Ptolemy IV soundly defeated Antiochus III. Verse 12, and when the multitude is taken away, his heart shall be exalted, and he shall cast down tens of thousands, but he shall not prevail. Ptolemy IV was victorious, but he was not able to strengthen his position, and he died around 205 BC. Cast down, he began to persecute his subjects, including the Jews, when they resisted his entrance into the temple, and he had multitudes of them killed. Verse 13, and the king of the north shall rise again, a multitude greater than the first, and after some years he shall come on with a great army and abundant supplies. So in 201 BC, Antiochus III invaded Palestine again. After some years refers to 16 years between the Battle of Rapha and his second invasion, giving him time to amass a great army and supplies. Verse 14, in those times many shall rise against the king of the south, and the violent among your people shall lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they shall fail. One of those who rose against Ptolemy V was Rome, who was very violent and robbed the people they had conquered. In verse 15, the king of the north shall come and throw up siege works and take a well-fortified city. And the forces of the south shall not stand, or even his best troops, for there shall be no strength to stand. Antiochus III captured Gaza from Ptolemy V in 201 BC and possibly conquered Sidon and making the Egyptian army surrender at the Battle of Panium in 200 BC, ending the Ptolemaic control of Palestine. So at this time, the Ptolemy dynasty in Egypt ended in Palestine, and then we revert to the Seleucid dynasty that will dominate Palestine. Verse 16, but he who comes against him shall do as he wills, and none shall stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his hand. So here we have our compass point, shall do as he wills. And so we can rephrase that this way, but the Romans, who comes against Antiochus III, shall do as he wills, and none shall stand before Rome. And Antiochus III shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his hand. Verse 17, he shall set his face to come with the strength of the whole kingdom, and he shall bring terms of an agreement and perform them. He shall give him the daughter of women to destroy the kingdom, but it shall not stand or be to his advantage. Now there's a predominant view here. Because Rome was introduced in verse 16, the following verses are about Rome. There would be a power struggle for the kingdom of Rome between Octavian, who would become Augustus Caesar, coming against Mark Antony, who allies with Cleopatra VII in Egypt. She was a Ptolemy. Octavian's forces win the battle at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. Both Mark Antony and Cleopatra commit suicide. The movie Cleopatra in 1963 featured Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor portraying this battle that occurred between Octavian and Mark Antony with Cleopatra VII. When I was preparing my slides for this, I looked at the Seleucid and Ptolemaic dynasties, but then I noticed that there was a 150-year gap between Ptolemy V and Cleopatra VII, and I couldn't figure out why there was this gap. Why would there need to be a gap in between? Also, I looked in the commentary, Seventh-day Adventist commentary, and this story of Antony and Cleopatra in the Battle of Actium is repeated again in verse 25. And so why would you need to repeat something if nothing is enlarged upon or more detail. And so these two things right here puzzled me and got me looking again in a different direction. So there's an alternative view, and I've heard this view from Dr. Roy Gann and Pastor Tim Rosenberg. In trying to conquer Egypt, Antiochus III, the king of the north, made an agreement with the young Ptolemy V. He was about 15 or 16 years old, who was the king of the south, which included giving Antiochus' daughter, Cleopatra I, in marriage to Ptolemy in Egypt. Cleopatra turned against her father and gave up all ties to her ancestry Seleucid dynasty, and later became the queen of Egypt and adopted the Ptolemy dynasty as her own. In verse 18, after he shall turn his face to the coastlands and shall come capture many of them, but a commander shall put an end to his insolence. Indeed, he shall turn his insolence back upon him. So Antiochus III attempted to extend his empire by invading Asia Minor and Greece, but he was stopped and routed in 191 by the Roman general Manicus Arcelius Glabrio. Verse 19, then he shall turn his face back towards the fortresses of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and shall not be found. So Antiochus was killed while trying to plunder a pagan temple near Susa in 187 BC, just a year following those peace accords with Rome in 188 BC. Thus he stumbled and fell and was found no more. The role of the king of the north switches to Rome at this point. Rome is now the dominating power and has subdued both the king of the north and the king of the south through the treaty of Apamea in 188 BC. We're now seeing a power shift. In 194 and 192 BC, Ptolemy V sent ambassadors to Rome. However, the Roman Senate refused to admit the ambassadors and sent them back to Egypt. And then in 188 BC, the Treaty of Apamea between Rome and Antiochus III was signed. Rome refused to return Ptolemy's Asia Minor land possessions that were taken by Antiochus III in 190 BC. These lands became part of Roman possessions. And so now we have Rome as the dominant power in the Mediterranean. So looking at our four prophecies of Daniel, in Daniel 2, we see Greece being its middle and thighs of bronze. In Daniel 7, we see it like a leopard with four wings. In chapter 8, we see it as the shaggy goat. And in chapter 11, we see the king of the north and the king of the south between these two competing dynasties. Now we come to the summary of the prophecies of Greece. Greece ruled from 331 BC to 31 BC. Alexander's army conquered with great speed. After Alexander's death, the kingdom was divided between his four generals. Alexander had no heir that could actually continue the line of his reign. His son, his only son, was murdered when he was about 14 years old. So there is nobody to take the reign. The Battle of Ipsus in 331 BC cemented the kingdom into the four divisions under the four generals. Cassander took Macedonia and Greece. Lysimachus took eastward Thrace and Asia Minor. Ptolemy in Egypt, Cyprus, and nearby Asia Minor. And you had Seleucus in the area of the Indus River. In Daniel 10 verse 1, it states that the vision is a great conflict. And so in Daniel chapter 11, We have 10 great battles that are recorded during the time of Greece and the subsequent kingdoms, 331 to 31 BC. 3 times peace through agreements were attempted involving marriages and love affairs. You have Antiochus I of Seleucia marrying Bernice II of Egypt. That didn't work out so well. Cleopatra I married Ptolemy V of Egypt in 195 BC. That didn't work out so well. Cleopatra VII had a love affair with Mark Antony between 41 and 31 BC, and that didn't work out so well either. You had numerous assassinations and suicide. Alexander's son, Antiochus II, Bernice's son, Pompey, Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, and Cleopatra. God's people during this time in Palestine are caught in the middle between these great conflicts of military might, love affairs, and death and destruction. Some key battles of the Greek Empire is recorded in Scripture. 331 BC was the Battle of Arbela. This is where Alexander defeats the Medo-Persian forces. 301 BC, the Battle of Ipsus. This is the division of the kingdom into 4 parts. 191, the Battle of Thermopylae, which was fought with the Roman Republic, defeating the Antiochus III, or the King of the North, leading to the Treaty of Ampia in 188, which made Rome the clear dominating power in the region. 63 BC, Pompey lays siege to Jerusalem and takes it from the Jewish forces. In 31 BC, the Battle of Actium, Roman Republic defeats the forces of Cleopatra VII, who was the king of the south at the time, and Mark Antony, ending the last remnants of the Greek Empire. There are some key confrontations in Palestine. In 301 BC, Ptolemy I, the king of the south, invaded Palestine. In 283 to 221 BC, Ptolemy II and Ptolemy III set up military defenses and attempted to Hellenize Palestine, or turn them into more like the Greeks. Temple worship was continued pretty much unrestricted during this time. In 221 BC, the king of the north, or Antiochus III, attacked Ptolemy IV, but he was thrown back. 201 BC, the king of the north, Antiochus III, attacked again and then defeated Ptolemy V. Now, these next ones are not recorded, but I think they are good for us to know about. 201 to 275 BC, during Antiochus III and Seleucus IV, there was relatively peace in Palestine. From 175 to 164 BC, however, this was the time that Antiochus IV Epiphanes, he stopped all of the sanctuary ministries and attempted to force the Jews to be Hellenized. You've got a Maccabean revolt, 168 to 164 BC, and then from 164 BC to about 64 BC, you had relative independence in Jerusalem and the area around by various Jewish parties and factions. All right, and this ended when Pompey captured Jerusalem. The spiritual significance from the Grecian Empire. God's people were caught in the middle between the powers of the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, and they were pressured to become more like the Hellenistic world around them. Jesus is our protector from the world, the outside world, and from any kind of inner compromise that we may be pressured. Isaiah 41:10, fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my gracious right hand. Isaiah 40:31. But he who waits on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. This concludes Daniel from a Different Direction, the Greek Empire. Our next video will be over the Roman Empire. In the meantime, keep studying, and may God bless.